In tutorial 4.2, you are continuing with selection analysis, but this time you're selecting by location, whereas previously we were selecting by existing features or using an existing graphic or creating a graphic of our own. This effort here is taking a location, an existing location, in this case floodplains, and you're using that as your selection criteria. So you're selecting by the location, and what they've done, they've added a layer here that shows the floodplains, and you can see that part of these floodplains cut across our study area. And if you look at the boundaries on here for the parcel boundaries or the lot boundaries, you can see where parts of this floodplain, shown in kind of the peach colored here, cuts across part of our lot boundary. So in other words, this lot boundary that I'm moving my mouse on, for example, is not contiguous entirely within the floodplain. So part of this lot boundary is in the floodplain and part of it is out. Now, that presents a little bit of a dilemma when you're calculating your analyses, because we have in our table results for this lot boundary that shows the total acreage for that entire lot. So what we want to do is select using using the floodplain feature, and select in a way that we can ultimately get what part of the acreage that's in that lot falls within the floodplain. So there's a little bit of challenge there in doing that, and that's what part of this is about here in this tutorial. And I should mention something they don't clarify, but when you're looking at I'm going to open the table for these flood areas, and there's a field that they point out. There's a shape area field, and if you went through this exercise, it implies that you always are going to have that when you're working with data, that's just an existing field in the table. Well, that might not always be true, because again, as you'll see, and especially doing your class project, a lot of your layers are going to be shape files. And in fact, I have mentioned earlier that I kind of have a bias towards shape files, because the shape file is one particular type of data that ArcGIS uses, that it's kind of it's unique to Esri, but you'll find it referenced throughout. A lot of the data that you download from different sources and so forth will exist as shape files. And so you won't always, in fact, I would venture to say, especially on your class project, much of the time you won't find geodatabases out there that has the information you're looking for. Rather, you could opt to build a geodatabase from existing shapefiles and other types of data if you wanted to. Though in the case of our project, as I've mentioned elsewhere, you don't have to create geodatabases for it with all of your features anyway. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that if this had been a shape file, there's a good chance you would not see this shape area field. And that's one of the advantages of having a geodatabase, is that the geodatabase calculates these aerial features with the layer as part of a geodatabase. So since it's geo-referenced, then the program can go through and calculate a continuous area for you. And if we change that, if we were to cut or clip a boundary, for example, that is part of a layer in a geodatabase, these statistics would automatically be recalculated for us. Whereas in a shapefile, if we went through and clipped one of these features, we would have to make a mental note to come back and recalculate any aerial type of field we have, whether it was a shape area or just an acreage field or so forth. Like you saw in the previous tutorial, you saw an acreage field. If that had been a shapefile and we had clipped that, we would have to go in and manually recalculate that area. So that's one big advantage of a geodatabase, is that it will recalculate those for you automatically. But then again, the big advantage with the shapefile is that it's a much more widespread and much more common type of data source that you're going to come across and that you're going to find. And they're very easy to work with and so forth. So we'll see a lot of shapefiles in the class. And in this book, he's using a lot of geodatabase files. So just keep that in mind as you move throughout the class. For this exercise, it says that we need to find out how many parcels are in the floodplain and what total area of land is inside the floodplain. And they want a breakdown of area of land use inside the floodplain and a breakdown of how much of each flood zone category is in the selected area. Okay, and it points out that the 202 parcels are already selected, and that if yours becomes unselected, to repeat the procedure from the previous tutorial. Well, I don't know about yours, but mine was not selected because you don't see any blue lines around anything inside the graphic. So we need to repeat what we did in exercise 1 real quickly, and now that you've done that, it shouldn't be a problem. What we want to do is get our little selection tool, select the graphic, go to selection, and select by graphics, and that should get our 202 areas back in our selection. And notice I did that without going through and setting my selectable layers, which was kind of a mistake. I should have went through and made sure, but luckily it was already predefined as I had done for us before. But I should have done this first. I should have went to the selected to the list by selection and made sure that land use was the only selectable layer. So luckily it was, and they're now selected. So I'm going to go back to the view that shows just the layers. Now in the book it says to first write out what you want to do. That's not a bad idea to do, but they've already written it out for us here. And the main thing is just to understand the interpretation of it. You know, it says I want to select features from the currently selected set of the land use layer that intersect the flood areas layer. So we've got a lot of land use area in our total data frame here. We've selected 202 areas. So those 202 areas are the ones we're interested in. And that's what it's referring to, of the currently selected set. And it's going to select we're going to use that to select areas of the land use layer that they are intersected with. And so of the floodplain area. Now, of the total floodplain area, you can see we've got a lot more of it that exists outside our study area, but the one we're interested in is the area covered with our study area. So we'll go up to our selection menu, and this time we're going to select by location. And that brings up this box that basically helps interpret that sentence we just talked about previously. If you read the top of the dialog, it says select features from one or more target layers based on their location in relation to the feature layers in the source layer. Now by default, this selection method says select features from, and then you would pick a target layer down here. We're interested in just the features that we've selected, so we're going to change this option here to the last one, which is select from the currently selected set of features. Okay, and then of course the features we're interested in are the land use. So that's what we're talking about here, is the land use areas. So land use areas are the target layers. And the book notes that if you don't see it in your list, make sure this next option, only show selectable layers, is cleared. In our case, we saw previously that when we was in the list by selection, we saw land use is the only one that's selected. So if we had a check mark in that, we would still see land use here in our case, and that is the one that we're interested in. It just broadens it a little bit here. If you don't have that checked, you have the options to pick some other areas for your target, even if they're not in this selected list here. So that's why they're referencing that as a way to at least be able to see that. But either way, we should be seeing the land use areas in our case. Now our source layer is going to be the floodplains. Okay, so we want to change that from lot boundaries to the flood areas. And for the selection method, this is important here, because we want to make sure we get the right method. There are a lot of options here, and by default, you see it's got the target layer features intersect the source layer feature. And now that happens to be what we want in this case. And overall, you'll find you'll use that option more than others. But just click the box anyway so you can see a variety of the different source methods you could have picked. And they point this out in the text a little bit, that the intersect is going to get all of those areas that are at least totally or partially within the source area. So in other words, if we had picked the option, for example, that said that they had to be totally within the source that contained this, that contained it totally within the area, okay. For example, this one here, let's see, target layer features are completely within the source layer. Then that would only pick those areas that have the entire feature within that area, as it implies. So what would be left out, for example, if you can see my mouse, this lot here that I pointed out earlier that was partially inside, that would not get included in the analysis if we had picked that they had to be totally within the area. So we want those that are intersecting, and that's going to give us both, as long as they are either all inside or touch the area of the source area, they will get included within this select by location analysis. Now we also could simulate sort of like a buffer effect here by applying a search distance as well, but we're not interested in that in this case. So we want to make sure that everything looks like it does in the book on your dialog at the bottom of page 114, and it should look like I've got it set up here. And then we'll go ahead and say OK. And then our selections then change, you'll notice, from the 202 areas that we had before to this smaller set. Now it's still showing 202 up here, okay? That was from our previous selection, but what you're seeing selected in this analysis is just this set of the tracks here that intersect the floodplain areas. And to refresh my number up here, was showing 202, I just switched over to the layer view in the table of contents, at list by drawing order, and then switched back to the selection, and it basically refreshed it. I assume I could have went up here to view and refresh, and it probably would have done the same thing. But now you can see that we have 23 areas selected instead of the 202. Now the book points out that some of the functions that we want to perform are not going to be affected by some of these areas being partially inside and partially outside. For example, just to get a total number of parcels that are affected by a floodplain, then we can go to this view, this list by selection, and we can see the 23, and we know that 23 areas are affected. So that was one of the pieces of information they wanted to know, were how many of the parcels going to be affected with this floodplain. So 23 would be the answer there. But next we need to know how many acres that represents, okay? And it points out that we can't total the acreage because it would include some of the areas and some of the parcels that fall outside the floodplain. So we're going to need to perform an overlay operation to cut the parcels at the flood boundary, okay? Before we perform the analysis on the selected areas, the book has you go to what it calls the local search feature, and it just wants to point out that there is a description of some of the various tools that you can use on some of these types of overlay analysis. And if your search box over on the right hand side on my screen, you should see a search in the catalog tabs, and this is the search tab it's talking about. If you don't see that, or another way to bring it up is to go to the Windows menu here and then click the search option, and when you do, it will pop up the little window that they're showing. Yours might not initially show this view. Mine looked like this to begin with. There were two different types of overlay in the search. Now I had to type in the overlay tool set like they tell you to in the book, and what you want is this first one, and it tells you the type is tool set. If you click that, you will get a listing of the tools that they're showing in the book. And what you can do is you can hover over each one, and a little pop-up comes up that describes that type of an overlay tool. And you'll be using different ones throughout the semester. Intersect will be a common one, and then today the one you're going to use is the Union tool. And if you want to see a description of that, you can click on this and it will pop up a dialog. Let me move my I'm going to close this box for now, and the tool popped up. I use two monitors, and it popped up my second monitor. So here's what the tool looks like, and they show you this picture in the book. And I just wanted to point it out because it can be very confusing to beginners, especially, and even those of us that have used it for a while need a refresher every now and then on what a union really is. And they have a nice diagram here that that shows you visually, but it still can be confusing. So let me just summarize it briefly. When you're doing a union with two different layers, you're taking, like in this case, the purple and the yellow layer. Think of them initially independently. You've got a circle here, and it overlays onto this purple area. With an intersect tool, you would only get the areas where they have places in common, okay, areas where there's overlap, and that's a little more straightforward. But with the union, your result is going to be the entire area that is covered by both of those pieces. So you can see it's like doing an addition in a way. I mean, you're taking two areas, laying them on top of each other, but you're taking the total area covered by both of those areas as your result set. And furthermore, what it will do is it breaks them, it retains the pieces. So think of it like pieces of a puzzle, and the diagram shows it here. And you've got your circle, but that circle is broken up into three pieces basically, because it's broken into each of the areas where it had overlap of another polygon. And since there were two polygons in what was initially our purple layer, then that intersected the circle, you've got two pieces of the circle there that are independent polygons. And then you got the part where the circle was the only area, in other words, where there were no purple area, just the circle. That still exists as one part. The same holds true with the purple areas. Where they existed independently, you have two separate polygons there, one on the left here and one on the right. Where it overlapped with the circle, you have two other separate polygons. So in each of the resulting data sets, you would have all of these pieces basically. And so your result it can be very powerful, even though it is confusing. It can be very powerful in the long run, because you can do summary analysis with any or all of these pieces of information. In other words, you could look at the areas where there were no overlap. You could look at only the areas where there was overlap. And you could, any of those combinations. So keep that in mind. Just study the diagrams, and with each of the different analysis tools, you might want to look at the intersection tool and look at its diagram, and then read. And they have text down below that describes it in more detail. And there's another help feature that this was using the search tool. You can go to help up here, and you can go to ArcGIS desktop help, and you will end up with something like this. And I typed in overlay tool set into mine, and then I clicked on the overview of the overlay tool set, and here's its description. So it's more textual based than visual, but it has a lot of the tools in it, the same tools. And so you can click on the union tool, and it has yet another diagram illustration of it that might even be a little more straightforward than the other one. So I encourage you to browse through these, and that's all that the author is trying to get you to do in the book there, is just to glance at those. Don't feel don't be too stressed if you don't fully understand them right now. You'll understand them through use over time. So as you use them, you'll become more proficient with them. So just be aware of that. And also in general, the help feature is very useful with ArcGIS. If you have any questions about anything, it will let you type in a question here, and it will pull up information. Sometimes it's online where it's pulling it from, but it can be very, very useful. And so I encourage you, anytime at all that you have a question about something, check that out with their help. And another suggestion is to just use a help search like Google or something like that. There's enough published information out there now on the internet about ArcGIS that if you type in a question that references ArcGIS into the Google search box, a lot of times you'll get a lot of information, very useful, that will come up. And I have done that a lot and actually found very handy PDF articles and so forth on different topics that were very useful. So once you work through these exercises and or maybe later working on your project or something and you have a question about something, just type in a general question into Google and see what pops up. A lot of times you might find a very handy explanation or even an example of how to do a certain analysis that you're interested in or something. So just keep that in mind as you move forward. Now, they're going to run an analysis. I'm going to go ahead and run that to save space here and then come back after I've run the analysis in the book. I'm assuming everybody can do that just fine. And remember, in this case, you're saving it to a geodatabase called landusereport.mdb. So whereas we saved the table in the first exercise to itself, this time you're selecting a geodatabase back in your My Exercises folder where you're going to save this flood area of study, they call it, and you're saving it into the landusereport.mdb. So we'll be back here in just a few moments after we've run that. One other thing I just wanted to point out that the book has you execute the union tool from within that search feature that you pop up, which is perfectly fine. And notice I've got the little hammer to the left of these tools. You can also get to that same tool through your toolbox menu up here, the little ArcGIS toolbox window. You can get to that tool that way as well. So there's more than one way to do a lot of things you'll find in ArcGIS, and just wanted to point that out. Now I've decided to go ahead and run this tool with the recording going, just in case you have any problems with it. If it takes time to execute, I'll pause the video, but let's try this with it going live. Okay, there's our tool set, and if we go if we go back into it, when I ran the tool from the top of the dialog box, which by clicking on the Union Analysis tool, I'm getting this box in mind. This is a little puzzling here, but it may mean that there's something that's not fully installed. So you may or may not be seeing this. I'm leaving it on the recording just in case you do see it, so that we can try to resolve it together. It's saying that the website wants to run the following add-on, an ArcGIS product version library from Esri. If you trust the website and the add-on and want to allow it then to run, then click here. I'm going to go ahead and click that and let it add that, just in case it's something that I've turned off on mine that you are getting on yours. And it's still showing an error on mine, so I may have to try to resolve this elsewhere. I'm going to pause the recording just a minute. I should say also I had ran this earlier and I did not get this message, so I'm not sure why it's popping up this time. So if you may or may not have this issue on your end, and we'll see if we can't resolve it. I had noticed on mine as well that I've been getting some not responding errors on the top of my screen, and you notice my icon or my mouse shows that it's actively. I'm trying to close ArcGIS with the idea that I would reopen it, just in case something is corrupted. A lot of times when ArcGIS has a problem, or if you maybe run the same tool twice back to back without filling in the tool, like in my case I didn't really execute the tool, I just opened it and then I closed it and then I'm opening it again. I might have confused the program somehow. Don't know for sure what the exact problem is with it, but I know those kinds of things happen, And a lot of times what I find I have to do in those cases is just I'll close ArcGIS down. In a worst case scenario, and I only mention this because it's happening live on the fly here as we're doing this, but in a worst case scenario, what I'll do is actually reboot my computer. And it seems a little extreme, but I think what goes on sometimes with ArcGIS, it's such a big program that every time you run a tool or any kind of a button you click on in the program, it's executing yet another program in the background. And some of these programs can every now and then they'll become corrupt. Usually that corruption is just in memory. It's not actually part of the actual software code on the computer. So a lot of times you can resolve that through a rebooting. And so it might just be loaded into the computer's memory and it's causing some kind of a problem. And to be safe, what I'm going to do is go ahead and reboot my computer, and then we'll run this program again just to make sure if that's going on. And if you haven't had this happen, you will eventually. And so it's a good to point it out now that you're seeing it here. So we'll be back in a few minutes after I've rebooted everything. And just real quickly, I don't know if it's showing up, but now it is. You see that when I try to close again, it was just sitting there trying to close and wasn't, and now I'm getting this actual error that says it's not responding. Do I want to close the program or wait for it to respond? I'm going to go ahead and close the program. And then to be safe, like I said earlier, I'm going to go ahead and reboot my computer once I've closed everything I have open on it. Okay, we're back again now. I've rebooted my computer, restarted the project, and we're going to try this again. And like I said before, I'm glad that in a way that happened, because you can see number one, that things happen even to the instructor. So it's not just you. A lot of times you'll have something like this come up, and it's just part of working with GIS. I mean, it's something you'll have to get used to. It is the program in this case, but you'll find it with all programs that they have glitches in them. You'll find little quirky things that sometimes you can find an explanation to. Sometimes you just never know what it was. But it could have been, in this particular case, it could have been any number of problems. Another thing it could have been that I didn't mention earlier is that the memory situation on the computer. You know, ArcGIS is a real memory hog of a program. So if your computer has been on for a while, like I tend to leave mine on mostly all the time, and if you've been running other programs and so forth, opening and closing programs, you might have used up a lot of your RAM, and that could also cause problems like that. So it's just something to think about. I'll point out from time to time what may seem like strange patterns and so forth, habits to follow, and a lot of those reasons that's what's worked for me over time. Over the years, I've learned that I can do certain things or not do certain things, and that will help me with running programs and things. So some of the things I mentioned to you, like you'll hear frequently about the file naming, trying to keep your files no more than 8 or 10 spaces in length, or characters in length with no spaces, not putting things under your My Documents folder, things like that. Those are all reasons why I do that, because I've found that over time I find that it tends to help for whatever reason. So anyway, wanted to point that out. Another thing is I never saved, like I mentioned in tutorial 4.1, that it might be a good idea to save your project as soon as you open it and rename it to My Tutorial, and go ahead and put it in your My Exercises folder like you normally would do at the end of the exercise. Might be a good idea to do that at the beginning, and that helps. Like in cases like before, had I done that, I could have just opened my project up. In this case, I had to go back through and select the 202 polygons again and so forth. So I'm going to save that right now, and I'm going to go over here and save as, and we'll route that to the My Exercises, and we'll call it My Tutorial 4.2, and save. Okay, now that that's saved, let's try this again. We'll go back to search. We will do like the book was doing, though we could do this from the tool set. Let's go overlay. And we'll run our union tool. Cross your fingers. Okay, it has opened. It's open on my second window, so I'm going to move it over. Looks like it worked this time. Like I said before, it had worked the first time when I ran it, and I didn't fully execute it. I just got to this point to make sure everything was working like the book was explaining. Then I closed it down and ran the recording and reran this, and that's when I got the error. So that happens. It looks like it's working this time, so let's go ahead and follow through the chapter. The first thing that we want to do is add the two layers that we're going to be overlaying, and those are what we call input layers. And so the way we add those is one at a time. We click on the drop down, we'll add the flood areas, and that added it to their table. Then we'll go ahead and input and add the land use layer. Okay, now we've got both of those layers in, and we're going to name this. We want to route it. Notice again how it's taking it to your document subfolder. We want to route it over to the my exercises folder, which it remembers when I click that browse button, since I was in there last. In this case, we're going to name this the flood area of study, but we want to save it into the land use report geodatabase. And we're wanting a geodatabase instead of a shapefile this time, because we want to take advantage later of the automatic area calculation features and so forth that comes with looking at the polygons as they're being split into different parcels and so forth. So I'm going to double click on the land use report MDB, and you can see here by the top that we're now inside that geodatabase, and now we're going to create a feature class within that geodatabase, and we're going to call the feature class flood area of study. And we'll save, and we check our path, make sure it's correct, make sure all the other settings are set to what they show in the diagram in the book. We've got feet for our units, we've got all, and we're not going to worry right now about the meaning of each of these options. The gaps allowed is checked. Okay, and then we will go ahead and execute this. You can see at the bottom of the screen down here where I'm moving the mouse, that is how you know something is executing. It's a little different in this version of ArcGIS than the older ones, for those of you that have used the older ones. And you have to be patient, let that run, and when it finishes, your screen will refresh, and you'll know that you've ran the tool. And I'm getting the little toolbox. I wish I could get it over to where you could see it. It's on my other window. A little blue toolbox pops up in the lower right corner of your screen that tells you the name of the file you created with the little hammer tool next to it, and that lets you know that it's executed. On mine, I'm using 2 monitors, and it looks like by default it's popping up in my monitor number 1. I couldn't get it to move over fast enough for you to see it on the recording. So look for that in the lower right corner of your screen. Once that pops up, you know it's finished, and then you can go ahead and proceed. Try not to click anywhere or do anything while that is running, and just realize it may take it a little while to run depending on the speed of your computer and so forth. Now notice also that we have a new layer that's been added to our table. We actually created a new layer of data with this, and it's called the flood area of study. And you can see it's all the same color here on the areas that we have selected. We can turn that off, and you can see that indeed it is a new layer there. And we can open up the table if we want to, just to browse to that table to see what it looks like. And mine again popped over in my screen number 1, so there we go. Let's get it back. And you can browse through that table to see, and what's interesting is to compare that maybe with the existing table, the flood areas, for example. If I open that up, one of the drawbacks that I don't like about the new version of ArcGIS is it wants to open the tables in the same window, and a lot of times I like to switch back and forth between the tables. And you can do that if you look on the bottom, down here in the bottom left corner of the table, you'll see the tables that are open. And so I can at least click back and forth with those to see them. And so if I click back and forth, you can see that here was our original flood areas. And let me go ahead and open up the land use area as well here. So there's land use. You can see the fields there. Just looking at the first, look at the first few fields we'll focus on here. Property description 1, property description 2. We go to flood areas. We didn't have much in there. We had the zone, which was important. Okay, then we go to our new table, and you'll see that we have the zone, okay, still. And we go over here and we see property description 1, property description 2, and so forth. Now, here's the zone that we had, okay, and here are the property descriptions that we had. But you'll notice you've got some new fields, a couple of them at least here. One called FID, flood zone. And if you look back in the flood area, you didn't see a FID in there. Okay, the FID, and we also have an FID parcels. Now if you're wondering where the word for the FID flood zone, where flood zone and parcels and the other FID come from, they're coming from the two layers that we use to do the union with. Now if you look at those names, again we had land use and flood areas, but those were actually parts of geodatabases. And if you right click, for example, on land use and look at the properties, go to source, oops, I was there, you'll notice that the feature class name is parcels for land use. So that's where the FID parcels is coming from. It's coming from the name and the feature class. And likewise, if you went into flood areas and looked at its feature class, you would see it's called flood zone. And there you can see that. And so that's where those names are coming from. And the FID field is just something that gets added as a result of that union. The neat thing here is that the values in that FID, in those FID fields, will contain a -1 in areas where they don't have the overlap. So for example, for the areas where we have flood zone but did not have parcel data overlap, then we've got a -1 in the flood zone here. So if I go to the top of the table, you see we've got some numbers here. These are the actual flood zone numbers until you get to there. You see some -1s, and in this area we did not have overlap with the parcels. There was no parcel data there. And the numbers, like in flood zone again, where you do have numbers other than -1, what those numbers represent, they represent the parcel information. If I go into the, and I say parcel, which was the land use, if I go into the land use, let's see, I'm sorry, it's the flood areas. If I go into the flood areas, for example, I've highlighted here a 734, which was the object ID in that table. And if you go over here, you'll notice the zone name was Westdale Creek in 734. And if I go into my union table and I find a value up in this flood zone of 734 right here, you'll see there's Westdale Creek. So you can tell that that indeed is a match, that what this FID number here is, even though it says flood zone, now what that is the object ID number that came out of the flood areas table. Okay, that's that piece of information. Likewise, if I look down here at this first one where I'm getting I get -1s here in the flood zone, but I get positive numbers in this parcel category. If I look at the 3470 and I see this property description of Hut Andrew, I think it is, and if I go into the land use table and I look down for 3470, then I see there's the Hut Andrew again. So you can that just sort of verifies it to you. If you're like me, you like to know what's going on with these numbers. The book tells you the important thing here, which is that if there's a -1 in there, that's an area where you don't have the overlap.